Shalom. I greet all of you. I'm glad to see you all. Shabbat Shalom. Wishing everyone a wonderful mood. And we continue with our course After the Flame, in which we explore the history from the year 70, after the destruction of the temple and the destruction itself, up to the year 325, the Council of Nicaea. We are actively exploring and diligently studying together the rich and complex history of Israel, its foundational formation, its remarkable survival, and its significant development over time. And at the very same time, we are also carefully looking at how, let's say, the intricate path of the Messianic communities profoundly unfolded, moving from their initial Jewish synagogue-based groups and traditional synagogue worship practices to what we now commonly call Christianity and the Byzantine Empire. We will be analyzing and studying all these paths together because, from the perspective of Jewish history, we are in the era of the Tanaim, the so-called sages of the Torah. So, today we're talking about one of the most remarkable personalities. We started talking about him in the previous. The sound is quieter than in the last broadcast. It should be better now. They're saying the sound is fine. My friends, don't confuse me. You're watching on different phones, so it's different for everyone. For some it's fine, for others it's quieter, for others it's louder, for some it's normal, for others it's something else. That's it. So, last time we talked about Rabban Gamliel II, not the first, don't mix them up. Today we're going to study a bit about his life story. I'll also tell you some other interesting details. And today we're kind of wrapping up this block. And next week we'll move on. Marina wrote, the sound is great. Marina, finally at least something good. Next week we'll move on to a completely different topic. We'll be talking about Messianic communities, about their development, their life, their structure, who they were, and so on and so forth. So we'll be talking about the Apostle Paul, whether his legacy is actually alive, what it has turned into, what it is not, and what it really was back then. Next week, we'll talk about who the Nazarenes were, who the Ebionites were, who the Gnostics were, and who the Hellenists were. The problem of Greek philosophy. We'll talk about the first non-canonical text. We'll discuss the issue of identity, synagogue, and church. All of that is for next week. We'll also talk about the persecution of Christians. Why did Christians reject paganism but not reject the Torah, and so on and so forth? Eventually, we'll gradually move on to the year 132. That's to Rabbi Akiva. Today, we'll also talk about Rabbi Akiva because Rabbi Akiva worked together with Rabban Gamliel II. And also, we'll talk about Bar Kokhba as well. We'll be talking with you about the most tragic story, the revolt of the years 132 to 135, and about how Rabbi Akiva dreamed of seeing victory in the Messiah and chose Bar Kokhba as that Messiah. In the end, everything ended tragically but Rabbi Akiva still remained the greatest sage and figure of his era, who began studying the Torah only at the age of 40, was the son of a convert to Judaism, and Rabbi Akiva himself was just an ordinary shepherd. We will be studying all these things together in the coming weeks. I deliberately laid out this whole plan for you so that you could gradually start to picture the sequence of events in your mind. I'm intentionally not giving you a written outline of this course because I want it to stay dynamic and I don't want to tell you exactly what's coming. Instead, each time I'll let you know what the next lesson will be about. Because I might make and keep making some changes, and I want those changes to come up as we go. So. We've studied the destruction of the temple together. We've studied the captivity, the millions of people, the hundreds of thousands who were taken into Roman captivity. We've looked at the huge wave of anti-Semitism that rose after the year 70. We've learned how Yohanan ben Zakkai and Rabban Gamliel managed to escape, how they carried him out in a coffin, in a shroud, smuggled him through Rome, and how they established a center in Yavne. Today we're going to continue this topic, and with this topic we'll conclude this period. So let's return to this point again. So why call Rabban Gamliel the savior of Israel? Don't confuse him with the Rabban Gamliel in Acts of the Apostles. That was the first. This is the second. But this entire dynasty is very important to us, and we study it. In church educational programs, in Bible schools, in Christian ones, they don't study this history. But this history is extremely important, especially for those who are returning to the house of Israel. Because returning to the house of Israel, one must return to the house of Israel by returning to history, not just by making things up for oneself. So why is Rabban Gamliel called the one who saved Israel? He didn't win back the land. He reformatted the very idea of the people by creating what historians would eventually call Rabbinic Judaism. Now, many Christians spit at this word, and many Messianics rejectingly call it Rabbinic Judaism. But it was precisely this Judaism, now tied not to the temple but to the teachers of the Torah, that made it possible to replace the physical center in Jerusalem with a portable one. The intellectual center became a unified law. A unified calendar is formed, a unified prayer is established. Essentially, Rabban Gamliel creates a portable homeland. I keep explaining this to those who are turned off, who recoil at the term Rabbinic Judaism. They like biblical Judaism, but they don't like Rabbinic Judaism. But, excuse me, Christianity has exactly the same problem. Christianity is, in principle, the same kind of doctrine created by the Church Fathers. It's the same rabbinic thing, just in a different form. In short, all this ignorance comes from the fact that people simply don't understand what they're talking about. That's it. They just repeat common stereotypes, the ones that, as a rule, are voiced by other people. So, Rabban Gamliel showed that holiness can exist not only in a specific place, that is, in the temple, but also in time, that is, in Sabbaths and holidays. This is the same thing Yeshua said. The time will come when people will worship me not on this mountain and not in this place, but will worship me in spirit and in truth. In other words, the time will come when you, the people of Israel, will be scattered across different countries and cities, and you will no longer be tied to a single place. These are all temporary conditions, but the time will come, as the prophets say, when the Creator will bring Israel back again, and once more there will be movement around the Temple Mount. As explained to us by the prophets Zechariah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, the nations will gather on the Lord's mountain. Why will they gather on the Lord's mountain when the mountain no longer has any meaning? It didn't have meaning even back then, at that time, but it will have meaning today. That's why it's important to study the eras, not just the words written in the Bible. Now, to understand the scale of Rabban Gamliel's achievement, we need to grasp the depth of the abyss in which Israel found itself. It wasn't just a military defeat, as it might seem to us. It was the collapse of Jewish civilization. A total collapse. It was a political disaster. Judea was no longer a kingdom, but a trampled Roman province. I'll switch back to the slide that clearly shows us all of this important information. Josephus Flavius writes about rivers of blood. He writes about millions who perished. He writes about 97,000 talented young men and women who were sold into slavery. The Romans didn't just win. They wanted to erase even the memory of Jewish statehood. A spiritual vacuum formed because the temple was the only place for sacrifices, the main way to communicate with God. Its destruction meant the severing of that connection. How could sins be atoned for now? We talked about this with you. How should one pray now? Ahem, ahem. The great sage Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai saw the ruins and wept. His student asked him, "Teacher, why are you Pa, why are you crying?" And he replied, "I cry because the place is destroyed. The place of our heart is destroyed." It was a feeling of complete abandonment by God. And that's truly what it was. The streets were full of people in despair. Society had split into many factions. There were ascetic suicides. Groups appeared who refused wine and meat, condemning themselves to starvation, since these products used to be poured on the temple altar, which no longer exists. And so they could no longer eat these foods. Apocalyptic groups emerged. Even today, these apocalyptic thinkers still hold sway over our minds. They expected the end of the world and divine intervention to come at any moment, rejecting any earthly activity. There were also collaborators. They claimed that the only way forward was complete submission to and assimilation with Rome. We have no other choice. Rome is stronger, we need to survive, so we must submit and surrender. The people were turning into dust, ready to be scattered by the winds of history, just as happened, in fact, to dozens of other ancient peoples whom Rome conquered. They vanished from the earth and from history. At this moment, Rabban Gamliel II steps onto the stage of history. That's what we'll be talking about today, about his fate and about what actually happened. We talked about this last time. Well, we started talking about it last time. Today, we'll sort of wrap it up. His name, or rather his title, is Nasi. Nasi is, how should I put it, a prince, a president. Today, Nasi means president. He was the heir to a great dynasty, a direct descendant of the sage Hillel, the founder of the Pharisaic school. His title was passed down within the family from generation to generation and was recognized by the people and, albeit grudgingly, even acknowledged by the Romans, who preferred to deal with one of the recognized leaders rather than someone unrecognized. Now, Rabban Gamliel was considered a man with a firm hand. Sources, especially in the Talmud, describe him as an authoritative, decisive, and at times even stern man. He was not afraid to enter into conflict for the sake of unity. But this sternness that Rabban Gamliel possessed was not tyranny. This sternness was the result of the times in which he lived and existed. It was, in a way, a conscious necessity. His remarkable story, which we are studying together today, demonstrates his authority, but also reveals the greatness of the sages of that generation. As we say, people of that generation are no longer with us, and that's true. After yet another conflict, a sharp conflict with Rabbi Yehoshua, and we will talk about this, the sages of the Sanhedrin decided that Rabban Gamliel had gone too far in his drive to assert his authority, and they removed him from the position of president. They removed him. Otto, thank you. Just think about what I've told you. The sages of the Sanhedrin removed the president. They didn't stage a military coup. They held a parliamentary vote. It turns out that democracy already existed back then among the Jewish people. In the midst of a national crisis, the sages held a parliamentary vote. They were not afraid to challenge the most influential person. In other words, this is what I always try to explain to non-Jews or other peoples, especially Christians, that in the Jewish understanding, freedom is more than just one group usurping power over another. Freedom is an inner reality in which we exist, not even allowing ourselves to possess ourselves. And here we see that a vote is taking place in the Sanhedrin parliament. They remove the head, Rabban Gamliel himself, which in those times and under other circumstances would have been completely unthinkable anywhere else. Now, what does Gamliel do? He doesn't start a rebellion. He doesn't take matters into his own hands. He accepts the decision of the majority. And the next day, he comes to the house of study and simply sits in the third row like an ordinary person. In his place, the young and distinguished Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was chosen. Now we see an amazing thing, something that would have been absolutely impossible to witness in those times. Because back then, the world did not live under a democratic system. Absolutely. That's why gods in human form ruled, especially in the provinces of the Greco-Roman world. But it turns out that in Israel, there were free elections or free votes, especially on such a scale. It's absolutely unimaginable. Angelica, thank you. Iota, thank you. But soon the sages realized that they needed the iron hand of Gamaliel, that they couldn't handle the situation that had arisen because the chaos was absolute. And they asked him to return. And with complete humility, from the third row, he took the leadership into his own hands and fully submitted to the majority vote. This story shows us two things. First, the incredible internal democracy in the Sanhedrin, which at that time was absolutely incomprehensible to anyone else in the world, but already existed within the Jewish people. And second, the profound humility of Gamaliel himself, his willingness to put the common good above personal power, which was also impossible in those times, and even today is rare. Today, rulers tear everything apart just to stay in power for years, even decades, sacrificing millions of people. Rabban Gamliel calmly stepped down, handed over all his documents, so to speak, and quietly took a seat in another row. This is a unique thing that deserves to be studied, but I don't have time to tell you too much about this. Now we have 4 pillars of the new Israel. Rabban Gamliel does not try to build a temple out of stone. The temple is already destroyed. It has already burned down. He begins to build an eternal, portable temple in the hearts and minds of people. His headquarters becomes the small town of Yavne. And here are the 4 fundamental pillars on which, the 4 essential pillars he established, on which the entire world of Israel will firmly stand. The first is the unity of time. This was very important. Some of you might think this is nonsense, but it's absolutely not nonsense. There was a fierce battle over the calendar. You might say, really, that's what they fought over? But in reality, it's very important because in our commandments, there is holiness in time. So what's the problem? If each community celebrates Passover and Yom Kippur on different days, one community celebrates Passover in 1 month, another community celebrates Passover in another month. The people would simply break up into separate sects. Everyone would have the same thing that happened with Christian judgments. There was no single way. That unified way only appeared 3 or 4 centuries later, when the already fragmented, completely splintered services and all sorts of groups had spread throughout the Roman Empire. This is what the Jews managed to preserve and what laid a very important foundation. Rabban Gamliel decreed, "Only the Sanhedrin in Yavne has the right to sanctify the new month and set the dates of the holidays." Now, all the dates of the holidays. From now on, they will be calculated by the Sanhedrin and not according to how each person wants. Now, there was a conflict with Rabbi Yehoshua. He was another sage who had a disagreement with Rabban Gamliel. I'll tell you about this. So, Rabbi Yehoshua, a great sage, calculated a different date for Yom Kippur. Gamliel ordered him to come to him with a staff and a money pouch on that day. This was the day Yehoshua considered to be the holy day of fasting and rest, Yom Kippur. Now Gamliel tells Yehoshua, "Come to me with a staff and a money pouch," which is something you are not allowed to do on Yom Kippur. This wasn't humiliation, but rather a test of the entire system that Gamliel was building. What is more important, your personal sense of being right or the unity of the whole people? And here's what happens. Rabbi Yehoshua obeys. He enters through the doors on Yom Kippur with a staff and a money pouch. Then Gamliel stood up and kissed him, and he spoke great words which are recorded in our books. "Peace to you, my teacher and my student. A teacher in wisdom and a student because you accepted my words." Gamliel established the fundamental principle of central authority, which synchronized the life of the entire Jewish people. And here, of course, we must talk about the second giant of this era, without whom the picture would certainly be incomplete. We need to talk about Rabbi Akiva. He lived from the year 50 to 135, and Rabbi Akiva was killed. He was, of course, killed by the Romans, and thus his life came to an end. But his scholarship in the study of the Torah, because he established an entire principle for studying the Torah, and his contribution to Jewish history is immense, despite the mistakes with Bar Kokhba, whom they proclaimed the Messiah. But I understand that because a military leader was needed to liberate Israel, since Rome at that time was in agony, they did everything that, and we will tell you all about this in just a couple of weeks. Rabbi Akiva. He saw the temple. He was a young man. He saw the temple. He survived its destruction, and he became the chief sage in the visible and spiritual leader of the Parkaba rebellion. The most incredible thing is its origin, which is what I am trying to explain to you. According to tradition, Rabbi Akiva's father was a ger, meaning he was not a Jew, that is, he was a righteous proselyte. A righteous ger who converted to Judaism. Akiva himself was the son of a ger. He did not belong to the nobility, and priestly blood did not run in his veins. He was a simple shepherd, And here in this image, you can see a shepherd's staff on one side and Rabbi Akiva on the other. He was an ordinary shepherd who couldn't read until the age of 40. He couldn't even read. Just think about that. The greatest sage of Israel, upon whose wisdom the entire Talmud stands, had neither noble origins nor an early education. His story is an absolute triumph of spirit and proof that greatness in the Torah is not a matter of blood, but of dedication and hard work. And those who turn all of this into nothing but nationality and blood and so on are simply making a big mistake. That's why today we are spreading this in the Beit Midrash. This is the path of righteous converts, people who, with God's help, will be able to accomplish the same thing that Rabbi Akiva did. That is, to become the greatest servants and sages of their time. And this is a person who, even without any formal education, became the chief intellectual force in the Sanhedrin of Rabban Gamliel. Their alliance, their tandem, was absolutely unique. Rabban Gamliel was the head, he was the president, the Nasi, the leader who provided structure and unity. And Rabbi Akiva was the brain, he was the heart, he was the genius who systematized the laws and inspired the entire people. I've already told you about the prayer. There are 18 blessings, but at that time a 19th paragraph was added known as Birkat Haminim, that is, the blessing about the heretics. The blessing about the heretics was, in essence, a curse directed at the apostates. Why was this necessary? Because at that time, there was a massive defection of Jews from the Jewish world under the threat of death and destruction. Many adopted Greek beliefs, accepted Greek gods, and spread the idea that this was absolutely necessary. Otherwise, survival was impossible. Also, in the midst of chaos, numerous Judeo-Christian and Gnostic sects began to appear. These groups blurred the boundaries of Judaism. Why am I talking about this? Because it's important to understand. By that time, there was no longer a single unified center, as there had been during the lives of the apostles. During the lives of the apostles, there was Jerusalem, where the apostle James was, where all the councils gathered, and where it was decided what was right and what was not. After the death of the apostles and the destruction of Jerusalem, after the execution and death of everyone, everything scattered, and Jerusalem ceased to be the center. The center tried to shift to Antioch. But at that time, throughout the entire Roman and Greek world, a huge number of Gnostic sects were emerging. These were Judeo-Christian sects. They no longer fit within the boundaries of Judaism. They attended synagogues, but at the same time preached ideas that the sages considered foreign and dangerous. Even back then, there was already the deification of Yeshua, worship of him, and prayers to him, which for Jews was considered impossible, because worship and prayer were reserved only for the one Creator. From the sages' point of view, this was a painful but, in a way, necessary surgical incision, because if it hadn't been done, it would have been impossible to preserve the core of the faith from being diluted. The church itself was being pulled in different directions. We will also talk about this and reflect on it as well. Nevertheless, within the Messianic groups, there remained communities that maintained a Jewish way of life, circumcised their children, kept kosher, observed the Modim, the Lord's festivals, and considered themselves part of Israel. There were such groups as well, but they were already becoming a minority and were no longer accepted as. In fact, at that time, thoroughly Gnostic sects were on the rise, and by the 2nd century they were already taking shape. For their part, what was happening openly the sages of Israel could not accept. Of course, they could not accept it. In turn, a prohibition was imposed. This split would continue. The whole reason for all of this is that after the death of the apostles, the center shifted from Israel to completely different forms, and faith in the Mashiach itself became personalized and stopped being a part of Israel. It simply became a part of faith, and so on. About all of this, we will talk with you. So Gamaliel understood that the oral law needed to be preserved. And clearly, under his leadership and using a revolutionary methodology. Rabbi Akiva, this is something we will also discuss, began a colossal effort to collect, discuss, and systematize all legal opinions. Before that, everything was preserved in oral tradition. This work became the raw material from which his student, Rabbi Judah the Prince, a generation later, was able to create the Mishnah. This is the great codex of the oral law. But all this activity would have been impossible without the talent, wisdom, and diplomacy. He did not only stay in Yavne. The Talmud repeatedly mentions his trips to Rome together with Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva, and other sages. They were already traveling to Rome back then. They engaged in dialogue with the Roman authorities. They tried to overturn the harsh decrees that Rome issued against the Jewish communities in order to protect the rights of these communities. Rabbi Akiva and Rabban Gamliel knew how to speak to the Roman emperors in their own language. They tried to explain that the Jews were not just rebels, but a people with an ancient law capable of self-governance. Such a soft political approach provided a respite. This respite was necessary for internal work. But in the end, Rome became completely brutal. They simply wanted to build an entire city for Zeus on the territory of Israel. We will talk about this. Basically, they wanted to create it right on the site of Jerusalem, which was absolutely impossible. So. Why do we call Rabban Gamliel the man who saved Israel? It's important to understand this. Without this, I don't think we can move forward. These are the most important points that will send us further into history. He truly saved Israel because everything could have turned out completely differently, and we could have disappeared from this world, just like so many other peoples have vanished. Rabban Gamliel didn't fight to reclaim the land anymore. Instead, as I already mentioned, he reformatted the very idea of Rabbinic Judaism, which is centered around teachers and rabbis. He replaced the physical center in Jerusalem with a portable intellectual center. He created a unified law, a unified calendar, and a unified prayer. Essentially, he created a portable homeland. He truly demonstrated that holiness can exist not only in a specific temple, but also in time, in Sabbaths, in holidays, and so on. He didn't save Israel from the Roman sword. He saved Israel from internal chaos, from internal collapse, from oblivion, turning tragedy into a point of powerful new beginning. In other words, Rabbi Gamliel was the architect of survival. His legacy is not stone monuments. We actually don't have any stone monuments at all. We simply don't need them. His legacy is the Jewish people who 2,000 years later still celebrate holidays according to a single calendar. We pray with the same words and live by the law, the systematization of which they began 2,000 years ago. Rabbi Gamliel took the people when they were on the edge of an abyss, and with his firm will and wisdom, he built for them a bridge to eternity. Everything stands on that. Every subsequent generation stands on what happened back then. That's why I wanted this section to end in exactly this way. Next week, we'll step a bit away from the Jewish theme and talk about the legacy of the Apostle Paul. Is his legacy still alive, and has it been understood correctly? We'll discuss who the Ebionites were, as well as other groups that existed at that time. We'll talk about who the Gnostics and Hellenists were. And in general, the problem of Greek philosophy, how it simply took over the minds of believers. We'll talk about the Didache. We'll discuss the issue of identity between the synagogue and the church. We'll be talking about Christianity, about Rome and Nero's persecution, about why paganism was rejected, but at the same time not completely rejected, the Torah. Ultimately, we'll talk about Rabbi Akiva. We'll get to year 132, year 135. We'll discuss why Rabbi Akiva chose Bar Kokhba, why he saw in him the greatest general capable of standing up to Rome, and why this tragedy marked the beginning of the absolute diaspora. Jews were simply forbidden to be in Eretz Yisrael, but there was always a Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael despite this. And now Israel received a new status. Judea got a new name, Palestine, nicknamed after the Philistines, or the Philistines, that ancient people whom even Abraham fought against, and so on and so forth. We have a big plan. And God willing, nothing will be able to stop us in this. My friends, I wish you all blessings. Thank you for tuning in to these historical lessons. And it is a great honor for me to launch such a course and gradually move forward with you. What we say and explain here, what we explain to you here, in this course will lay down an important picture of awareness, will create an important picture of understanding what happened back then and what is happening today. This will give you more tools to understand how to act in the current circumstances. And hit the bell so you don't miss anything. Our broadcasts and also donations. Don't forget to make them. I wish you all blessings. We'll see each other tomorrow. Have a wonderful Shabbat. May everyone be in a good mood. Shabbat Shalom to all.